Hezbollah continues to violate the ceasefire agreement, and Iran continues to try and send fresh supplies of weapons to them by air. Therefore, the IDF continues to push back against these violations. Meanwhile, Hezbollah has already begun to send fighters and resources to Aleppo in Syria to fight back against an offensive by Turkish-backed forces who have launched a new phase in their years-long rebellion against the Assad regime. Russia and Iran are also rushing forces to try and rescue Assad, who is promising a counterattack to retake the Syrian city of Aleppo. Elsewhere in the Gaza Strip, UNRWA has announced that they are halting the transfer of humanitarian aid because so much of what they've already tried to deliver has been and continues to be stolen. The IDF continues to choke Hamas on the ground, while on the diplomatic front, we begin to see some cautious optimism in Israel that the deal to release the remaining Israeli hostages is near. Hamas is under pressure and running out of both friends and options. So, they have decided to compromise on a point that they have long insisted was non-negotiable. We have a lot to talk about today, so let's dive into the details. I'm Yair Pinto, and this is your Boots on the Ground report about what is happening in Israel on the 424th day of the war against Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and all the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. All of them are acting under the auspices of Iran, the head of the axis of evil in the Middle East. A moment before we begin, please look for the subscribe button and click on it so that you'll never miss another episode of Boots on the Ground. Subscribe to TBN Israel on YouTube. The ceasefire came into effect last week, and since then, we continue to see violations of the agreement by Hezbollah. Yesterday, the Israeli Air Force detected an attempt by Hezbollah to move fresh supplies of weapons and ammunition from Syria into Lebanon and hit the trucks moving those supplies. It must be explicitly understood that Hezbollah continues to violate this entire agreement by attempting to transfer weapons within Lebanon and into Lebanon from Syria and Iran. Speaking of attempts to bring weapons from Iran, in the last 24 hours, the IDF had to order an Iranian aircraft headed from Syria to turn around and head back east. The plane was owned by Iran civilian airliner Mahan Air, but it was suspected of carrying weapons and ammunition meant for Hezbollah. Israeli aircrafts intercepted this plane in mid-air over Syria and ordered it to turn back, which it did. In this context, it is important to point out that as part of the ceasefire agreement, the United States gave Israel a document called the Letter of Assurances, which states in part that the United States is committed to cooperating with Israel to curb Iran's destabilizing activities in Lebanon, including preventing the transfer of weapons, proxies, and others from Iranian territory. In practical terms, this means that Israel has political cover from Washington to take action to prevent Iran from sending fresh supplies of weapons and ammunition to Hezbollah, even if they try to do it using civilian aircrafts, ships, or ground transportation. Speaking of acting on the ground, in the last 24 hours, the IDF detected several Hezbollah violations of the ceasefire agreement in Lebanon and acted to shut these violations down. In one such instance, paratroopers from the 98th Division identified several armed terrorists near the local church building in a village in southern Lebanon. The paratroopers opened fire on these terrorists and eliminated them. It was determined that these terrorists were active in the ground defense systems, anti-tank and artillery in the sector and took part in the fighting while using the church. The IDF troops then conducted a search of the area near the church building, and a tunnel filled with weapons and ammunition was found. A statement about the incident by the IDF spokesperson's unit declared that the IDF is deployed in the southern Lebanon area and operates against any threat to the state of Israel. Shifting our focus slightly on Sunday evening, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Israel Katz met with recruits from the armored corps at their induction base. His remarks cover a range of topics, but was mainly focused on current events in Israel's north. We are constantly monitoring what is happening in Syria, he said. We are determined both to protect the vital interests of the State of Israel and to preserve the achievements of the war. If you're wondering why these recent events in Syria are of such acute interest to Israel, it is simply because Hezbollah is so deeply involved in them. Western intelligence sources estimated that Hezbollah has delivered forces from Lebanon to Syria in order to protect the terrorist organization's infrastructure there, including weapon smuggling routes and ammunition stockpiles. Hezbollah appears to be worried that assets of the organization and Iran will fall into the hands of the rebels in Syria, and they also have a long-term interest in preserving the Assad regime. Before we dive deeper into the impact of this offensive against the Assad regime by Turkish-backed Al-Qaeda-linked rebel factions in Syria, I want to invite you to visit our website at tbnisrael.com to stay updated on the latest news from Israel and the Middle East. You can also support our work on our website, tbnisrael.com. A Syrian opposition organization reported that Thursday that more than 140 people were killed in battles in northwestern Syria between Assad's army and rebel organizations just in the first days of the renewed rebellion. The Syrian army announced that its forces are responsible to an offensive launched by the rebels, while the Reuters news agency reported that the Syrian Air Force, along with Russian forces assisting Damascus in the civil war, bombed areas held by the rebels near the border with Turkey. Amidst all of this reporting about this most recent flare-up in the long-running conflict in Syria, it is vitally important to remember several key points. To start with, the Assad regime is a staunch ally of Hezbollah, and it is also a client of Iran and to a certain degree also Russia. However, the next key point to understand is that the forces attacking the regime right now are not much better. They are led by jihadist groups with strong historical links to Al-Qaeda, and there are also elements linked to ISIS, the Islamic State, amongst them. If one side or the other prevails over the other side, Israel will still be facing a big problem on its northern and northeastern borders. In other words, there are no good guys to root for in this conflict, and Israel must closely monitor the northern arena to be ready to face whatever threats emerge there from what is going on right now. With that in mind, we can take a look at the recent past to get a better idea about what might be about to happen next in Syria. It took Assad's regime and its allies, including Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah, more than 4 years to uproot the rebel forces from Aleppo, Syria's second largest city, the last time they had control of it. The offensive, launched by the rebel factions last week, was a big surprise as there has been little active fighting in Syria since late 2020. The regime forces appear to have been caught completely off guard, and the rebels were able to sweep into Aleppo and take control in a very short period of time. Many Western and Arab media outlets are pointing to the tremendous damage inflicted on Hezbollah by Israel in the last few months as the main cause behind the situation. The reasoning is that the rebels saw that the Assad regime's toughest ally had been weakened to a point where they had an opportunity to strike. The Wall Street Journal said in an editorial this week that this is a tectonic shift. Regional and international powers intervened in Syria over a decade ago, and now the conflicts of Ukraine, Gaza, and Lebanon all unite and meet in Aleppo, in Syria. It is certainly apparent that after suffering great losses at Israel's hands, Hezbollah and the other Iranian-backed Shiite militias in Syria, as well as what's left of the Syrian National Army, still loyal to the Assad regime, are struggling to stop this renewed rebel offensive. They have reportedly set up new defensive lines in northern Hama and Idlib, but the rebels appear to have momentum, and in the last 24 hours they posted videos of their fighters celebrating the capture of strategic cities, including Assad's presidential palace in Aleppo. The United States and Israel are closely monitoring these developments, with Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, emphasizing Israel's determination to maintain its security. The war in Syria, which began in 2011 and raged for several years before appearing to calm down in late 2020, claimed over 500,000 lives and left millions more displaced, including large numbers of refugees who fled to Europe and beyond. The country had only begun to rebuild itself from that terrible conflict in the last year or so, and now there is another large flare-up. But beyond the human tragedy, there are many geostrategic ramifications to consider. To start, this is another major setback from Iran. It exposes the weaknesses of the Ayatollah regime after a year of confrontations with Israel, and it also demonstrates that it is running low on the resources it needs to continue these confrontations. Its main proxy force, Hezbollah, can try and enter the battle and save the Assad regime, but they have little to offer after Israel had eliminated their senior command structure and eliminated large numbers of their most highly trained and motivated fighters. This leaves Russia as the main source of support for the Assad regime in this emergency, but they are also stretched thin after nearly 3 years of war in Ukraine. Here at TBN Israel, we will continue to report on every development in the northern arena going forward. Before we continue, I want to ask you once again to help us spread the truth by sharing our videos on YouTube, subscribing to this YouTube channel, and following us on social media. You can support us directly by making a donation at tbnisrael.com/give, so that we can continue producing high-quality content like this, bringing you the truth from the Holy Land, Israel. Now, let's get back into the news and switch our focus to events in the Gaza Strip. To give a brief review, the IDF operates in 3 main sectors in the Gaza Strip: Jabalia in the north, the Netzarim corridor in the central district, and Rafah in the south, bordering Egypt. In Jabalia, more than 1,000 terrorists have been captured in recent weeks, and the IDF forces have succeeded in creating a buffer zone that disconnects the refugee camp from the Gaza city. In the south, Nahal Brigade soldiers operate with the aim of defeating Hamas's Sabora battalion, and in the Netzarim corridor, Division 99 continues to expand the area under its control, which has reached the dimensions of a city. 2 months have passed since the beginning of the operation by Division 162 in Jabalia, and now only a few hundred Hamas terrorists remain in the refugee camp. According to the division's intelligence estimates, around 1,500 terrorists have been eliminated so far in this operation, while another 1,200 have surrendered or been captured and interrogated. Jabalia has been isolated geographically from the other parts of the northern Gaza Strip, and the army has completed the establishment of a buffer zone at a distance of about 5 to 6 kilometers south of the northern border of the Strip. These moves have created a complete separation between Jabalia and the nearby towns and Gaza City, preventing any connection between the terrorists remaining in the north and those that remain in the south. Along the edges of this perimeter, access points have been established, allowing for inspection of the population moving southward. In the course of these inspections, several terrorists attempted to flee the battlefield in civilian clothes, and they have been discovered and taken into custody by IDF soldiers. These terrorists were interrogated and provided valuable information that was useful for the IDF as it plans future operations to counter Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The IDF and the intelligence echelon estimates that Hamas is close to the end of its endurance, and this gives Israel leverage in the negotiations which are meant to bring the conflict to a conclusion and return the remaining Israeli hostages that are being held in the Gaza Strip. Beyond that, the IDF believes that the remaining Hamas operatives in Jabalia are the hardcore of the organization, including what remains of their most highly trained, motivated, and capable leadership. These are the true believers who will never be ready to surrender or compromise. Although they know that they have been defeated, they concentrated themselves in Jabalia to make a last stand, go out in a blaze of glory, and take as many IDF soldiers down with them as they can. That is all they have left. To try and make it as bloody as possible, they have placed hundreds of booby-trapped explosive devices in houses, streets, and everywhere else that they can to try and get IDF soldiers to explode. Please pray for these IDF soldiers who must try and go in to eliminate the last remnant of the Hamas fanatics in this very dangerous battlefield. Speaking of eliminating fanatics, in recent days there was a violent confrontation with Hamas terrorists in Bet Lahia, which is near Jabalia in the Gaza Strip. Dozens of terrorists were eliminated in this battle, which began when they walked into an ambush set by troops from the IDF's Givati brigade. The terrorists made a severe tactical mistake, explained the brigade's operations officer. They went out in a squad of dozens, straight into the killing zone. The declared goal of these operations is not only to clear the area of terrorists, but also the complete destruction of enemy infrastructure, both above and below ground, to prevent the need for future entry into the area. The IDF estimates that this will be accomplished in a few more weeks. Meanwhile, further south in the city of Rafah, Nachal Brigade soldiers, including Battalion 931, are working to destroy enemy infrastructures, particularly the remaining tunnel networks. Large amounts of weapons and ammunition continues to be found, meant to be used against the IDF troops. In particular, an enormous number of AK-47 rifles are being captured, and if you want to know more about that, my most recent episode of My State is dedicated to a report about this weapon, which is widely used by enemies of Israel and the United States. You can find this episode on TBN Israel YouTube channel. However, it is not just rifles that the IDF is capturing in the Gaza Strip. At the beginning of last week, the forces located a Russian-made guided anti-tank missile of a type not previously seen in this sector, and later 2 launchers of the missile were located. This is an example of the caches of weapons that Hamas has placed all over the Gaza Strip, meant to be used against the IDF whenever the opportunity presents itself. IDF troops have already captured vast quantities of these weapons and ammunition, but there always seems to be more. It's very sad to think about how much money and effort Hamas invested in death and destruction while ignoring the needs of the residents of the Gaza Strip for the daily bread, education, healthcare, and their many other basic needs. The IDF still has some work to do in the Gaza Strip, and that includes gathering up as much of these weapons and ammunition as possible in order to make sure it never gets used against Israel again. It also includes finding and demolishing terrorist infrastructure, especially underground tunnels and bunkers. That's what's going on in the military arena. Now, let's take a look at some diplomatic developments, but first, I once again invite you to click on the subscribe button so that you'll never miss another episode of Boots on the Ground. We'll start with another story about how Hamas and other terrorist organizations in the Gaza Strip brutally repress and exploit the civilian population of their own people for their own purposes. Felipe Lazerani, head of UNRWA, announced on Sunday that the agency has stopped transferring humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip through the Kerem Shalom crossing due to the enormous cases of aid thefts. We went on to explain that the way out of this crossing has not been safe for months. On November 16, a large aid convoy was robbed by armed gangs, and yesterday we tried to bring in several food trucks. All of them were also robbed. He added that this difficult decision comes at a time when hunger is deepening rapidly. The transfer of humanitarian aid should never be dangerous or become a test. It is important to remember that against the backdrop of American pressure last month, the IDF announced the expansion of the humanitarian zone in the Gaza Strip. This expanded humanitarian zone includes field hospitals established since the outbreak of the war, tent complexes, equipment for shelters, and supplies of food, water, medicines, and medical equipment that were brought in by the international community in coordination with the Israeli authorities. In this context, and keeping in mind what I said earlier about the hardcore of Hamas being concentrated in Jabalia and slowly but surely being destroyed by the IDF, Palestinian sources report that what's left of the Hamas leadership is open to gradual ceasefire agreements, similar to the agreement that we've seen in Lebanon. The latest outline proposed by these leaders included the gradual withdrawal of Israel, the return of the hostages, and the management of the Rafah border crossing by the Palestinian Authority. Israeli diplomats are currently in Cairo holding discussions about the day after the war is finally over in the Gaza Strip. Israel has proposed that an international committee will be set up to manage Gaza, with oversight by the Americans and the Egyptians, but without the involvement of the Hamas terrorist group. Meanwhile, there is cautious optimism in regards to a hostage deal. Four main factors stand in the center of that optimism. One, the ceasefire model in Lebanon that reflects also on Gaza, because Hamas is worried that it is now alone in the battle against Israel and fears the possibility that the IDF will reinforce forces in Gaza after disengaging from Lebanon. Israel is also about to have an ever stronger position with the incoming administration of President-elect Donald Trump in the United States. Here at TBN Israel, we will continue to report on all these developments moving forward. Now, to conclude, we take a brief look at events in Judea and Samaria. In the last 24 hours, the IDF carried out a nighttime operation to capture a warehouse in Ramallah that is being called the supermarket of weapons for terrorists and criminal gangs operating in the region. In the operation, large quantities of uniforms, vests, military equipment, tactical weapons, and combat accessories like flashlights, knives, and binoculars were seized. The warehouse posed a significant security threat, mainly due to the use of tactical vests that make it difficult to identify terrorists at terror scenes. Police sources emphasized that preventing the distribution of the equipment saves lives and reduces the risk to security forces and civilians in the Judea and Samaria sector. This follows a weekend which saw shooting attacks at different locations in Judea and Samaria, which left several Israelis wounded. Please continue to spread the truth, share, and follow us. And pray. Pray for the swift return of our hostages from Gaza to their houses in Israel. Pray for the peace of the people of Israel. Pray for the peace of the IDF soldiers wherever they are, in Lebanon, in the Gaza Strip, or in Judea and Samaria. Pray for the return of the residents of the north to their homes safely. And most importantly, unite in prayer for the peace of Jerusalem, and together we will win this war. Thank you, and God is always in control.
Hello, this is Mati here in Jerusalem with TBN Israel.
This is Yair Pinto from TBN Israel here in Jerusalem. TBN Israel is keeping viewers informed with Israel-focused news, culture, and what God is doing in this land.
Support TBN Israel today online at tbn.org/Israel. Thank you.